He was just a kid in a hoodie, standing at the edge of the private runway, holding nothing but a crumpled sketch and a quiet warning. "Sir, don't board that plane. Something's wrong with it." Security laughed. The pilot brushed past, and the millionaire. He paused just long enough to look back, because in the boy's eyes, there was something no adult had dared to say out loud. If you've ever wondered how truth can come from the most unlikely voices, stay close, like, share, or leave a thought. It means more than you think. At 7:42 a.m., Modesto Jet Center looked like any other private airport on the edge of California's wealth corridor, sterile, sleek, and sealed off from the world beyond its trimmed hedges. A morning flight was scheduled for departure. A Gulfstream G700, polished like glass, stood ready with its engines humming low, waiting for one man, Charles Ellison, CEO of Ellison Aerotech. He was halfway up the aircraft stairs when it began. First came the shouting, not from the terminal, not from security. Those sounds had rhythm, tone, order. This was different, desperate, wild. "Don't fly. Stop the plane. It's been sabotaged." Heads turned. A teenage boy, thin and scrappy, darted across the outer fence where a breach would normally trigger alarms. He was already past the second barrier before two TSA agents spotted him. Their calls overlapped. "Hey, you can't be here." But he kept going, breath hitching, voice hoarse. Charles froze on the stairway. His hand hovered above the railing. The boy ran like he knew time was thinner than anyone thought, as if what he had to say couldn't wait even one more breath. "The navigation unit, it's been switched," the boy shouted again, pointing straight at the plane. "It's the same setup that killed my dad." One agent reached the boy first, slamming him to the ground. Gravel scraped his cheek. The second officer knelt to cuff him, muttering something about a juvenile charge and federal trespass. But Charles didn't hear any of it. His eyes were locked on the boy's. There was no threat in them, no hunger for attention, just raw fear and something deeper, recognition. The engines roared a notch louder. A crew member in the cockpit waved through the glass, signaling readiness. A ground supervisor gave a thumbs up, waiting for Ellison to board so the jet could taxi. He didn't move. The boy, face pressed into the pavement, kept talking, not yelling anymore, whispering, pleading. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said, voice muffled but firm. "Thomas Carter was my father. He designed that system. He died because of it. And if you fly that plane right now, someone else will too." The name meant nothing to the TSA agents, but it landed on Charles like a jolt. Thomas Carter. The name stirred something old, buried beneath layers of meetings, contracts, and quarterly reports. Something he hadn't said out loud in years. Charles turned slowly. Behind him, the stairway led into comfort leather seats, a glass of scotch, a mid-morning flight to a defense summit in San Diego. Ahead of him, a boy was being shoved into a waiting vehicle, hands cuffed, jaw clenched, no cameras, no reporters, just the low sun casting long shadows on the tarmac. He took a step down. "Hold the flight," he said to no one in particular. "Sir," a TSA officer asked, startled. "Don't roll the jet." "Not yet." One of the agents hesitated, hand on his comm unit. "This kid's clearly unstable. Could be a prank." "Then you won't mind waiting," Charles said flatly. The boy's head turned slightly. One of his eyes caught the light. He didn't smile. He didn't look relieved. But his body eased just slightly. Charles didn't approach, didn't speak again. But he watched the vehicle pull away. And for a long moment, long after the doors had closed and the boy was out of sight, he kept staring at the gate like it had left something open. Inside the cabin, his phone buzzed with a reminder 9:30, briefing. He turned it off without reading the rest. He didn't know what he'd just seen, only that it didn't feel like something you could ignore. The interview room was small and cold, with fluorescent lights that made everything look older than it was. Ethan sat in a metal chair, hands folded in his lap, the cuff marks still red on his wrists. Across from him, a police officer flipped through a clipboard that had maybe 5 lines of actual information, but was being studied like scripture. The boy hadn't said much. His name, age, The city he used to live in, Tampa, Florida. He mentioned his mother worked nights at a clinic and that his father had died in an accident. That part, he said quietly, almost like he was already tired of repeating it. The officer leaned forward. You understand what you did today is serious. You can't just run across airport property and make threats about sabotage. Do you have any idea what that does to operations? I didn't make threats, Ethan said, voice even. I made a warning. The officer sighed, dropping his pen against the clipboard. And your father, you say he worked in aviation. He was a systems engineer, Thomas Carter. He worked for Ellison Aerotech for 9 years. Ethan's voice held steady, but his fingers were curling into fists. He designed the core logic for the G-series navigation module, the one you're still flying. And you're saying what? That's something on Mr. Ellison's plane today connected to that. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, very softly, yes, outside the room, through the one-way glass. The station's supervisor stood with a phone in hand. The line buzzed. He listened for a moment, then walked toward the room without knocking, across town, in a high-rise office above Palo Alto. Charles Ellison stood alone in his private conference room. The wall of glass behind him looked out toward the hills, but his gaze didn't reach them. He was staring at a printed security photo, low resolution, time-stamped in red, showing the exact moment the boy was tackled on the runway. Charles hadn't said much to his staff, just 4 words. Hold the morning flight. It had disrupted more than one meeting. Ellison wasn't known for hesitation. He was known for finishing, signing, deciding. But now, he stood with a silence that unsettled even his inner circle. The head of his avionics division had already called. We've double-checked the nav suite. Diagnostics are clean. If something had been tampered with, we'd see it. Charles nodded but didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the grainy image of a kid, barely a teenager, screaming at a jet, as if it had wronged him personally. It would have been easy to dismiss. A prank, maybe. A cry for help. But something about the boy's voice had cut through the hum of the tarmac. Something about the name, Thomas Carter. The name hadn't passed through Charles's ears in years, but it struck a place he hadn't visited in just as long. There had been issues, long ago, conflict, technical debates, a resignation that wasn't entirely voluntary. Charles had signed the paperwork himself. That boy had Thomas's eyes. He turned toward his assistant. Get me the Carter file from archives. The full version, internal notes, incident reports, all of it. You want that now? Charles nodded. Now, back at the police station. Ethan had gone quiet again. The officer didn't press. There was a rhythm to this kind of interview, and the room had reached one of those holding patterns where pushing harder did more harm than good. A knock came at the door. The supervisor leaned in and waved the officer over. Quiet words passed between them, words Ethan couldn't hear, but he could feel the temperature shift. When the officer returned, his tone had changed. All right, Mr. Carter, he said, like it was the first time he'd used the name properly. We're going to let you go home for now, but we'll need to follow up. Ethan blinked. That's it. For now, your mother's been called. I didn't give you her number. The officer hesitated, then looked toward the hallway. Outside, the low rumble of an idling engine filtered in through the concrete. A Blacktown car had pulled up outside the station. Its windows were tinted, its license plate unremarkable but clean, the kind of clean you didn't see on rental cars. Ethan stood as the officer unlatched the door. He stepped into the corridor, shoulders tight. The officers didn't stop him. They didn't explain. They just let him walk. Down the hallway, past the waiting chairs and dusty vending machine, he saw a tall man step out of the car. Dark coat, black shoes, silver tie, no badge, no name tag. The man didn't speak. He opened the rear door, nodded once, and waited. Ethan didn't ask who had sent him. He only tightened the grip on his backpack and walked toward the open door without saying a word. The private lounge inside Ellison Aerotech's headquarters wasn't meant for tense conversations. The furniture was plush, the lighting warm, the silence curated by interior designers who knew how to mute echoes of stress. But stress had a way of entering anyway, especially when it walked in with a boy in a hooded sweatshirt, backpack slung over one shoulder, posture tight, like he'd already braced for every possible outcome. Charles stood near the window, watching the boy approach. He'd requested the meeting, against the advice of legal and PR. They had warned him, do not legitimize a breach of security. But there was something about that moment on the tarmac, something not accounted for in any manual or protocol that made him ignore them. "Have a seat," Charles said, gesturing toward a chair opposite his. Ethan sat without a word. He didn't look like he belonged here. His shoes were scuffed. One sleeve of his hoodie was torn near the cuff, but his eyes were still sharp, still fixed on Charles, as if he were waiting for a signal that never came. "Tell me what you saw," Charles said. Ethan didn't answer right away. He unzipped his backpack, pulled out a manila folder with worn edges, and slid it across the glass table. Charles opened it slowly. Inside was a hand-drawn schematic, not recent, yellowed slightly at the corners, annotated in blue ink. He recognized the layout immediately. "This was your father's," he said. Ethan nodded once. Charles looked closer. There was a modification circled in red, with notations beside it. "That's the frequency vulnerability," Ethan said. "It was theoretical when he flagged it, but someone found a way to exploit it. I saw the same shielding module installed on your jet yesterday. It's not standard." Charles leaned back, folding his hands. "How would you even know what's on my jet? I was in the hangar. I've been watching this model for months. After what happened to my dad, I started following the patent updates, procurement logs. It's public, if you know where to look. You broke into an airport." Ethan didn't flinch, because no one listened when he tried to stop it. "And now you're still flying that same tech, only with a hole in it big enough for someone to walk through." Charles felt a pressure settle just behind his eyes. This wasn't a child making noise. This was someone who had memorized the way his father thought, who carried grief in the form of technical diagrams and government PDFs. He said if they didn't fix it, someone would die, Ethan said, voice low, and then he did. Charles closed the folder slowly. He looked up and saw the boy wasn't just pleading, he was accusing. "I remember your father," Charles said. "He was difficult. He was right." Charles didn't answer that. He stood, walked to the far side of the room, then turned back. "This vulnerability, why now? Why the urgency? I think someone's using it," Ethan said. "There was interference on the last batch of tests. Minor anomalies. I matched the signal profile. You're not an engineer. I don't have to be. I just have to care more than the people who built the wall." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no tremor. Just a line drawn so precisely that Charles wasn't sure when he had crossed it. He looked down at the schematic again. The handwriting beside the circle wasn't Ethan's. It was Thomas Carter's. A note scrawled faintly in the corner read, "Patch before flight review. Confirm with Ellison." He'd never seen it before. Or maybe he had, and didn't bother reading the margins. Charles looked at the boy again. "Come with me," he said. "Where to the test lab? I want to see if what you're saying is possible." Ethan grabbed his backpack without hesitation. They didn't speak as they left the room, just passed quietly through the hallway, like something important had already begun. The simulation lab was quiet, humming with low electrical whirs and the faint buzz of fluorescent ceiling lights. It wasn't open to the public. Few outside Ellison Aerotech even knew it existed, buried in the basement level of the Palo Alto campus. The lab was built for one thing, testing what hadn't yet failed. But this morning, Charles Ellison had allowed a boy inside, and already that choice felt heavier than expected. Ethan stood in front of the flight sim bay, his sleeves rolled back, hands trembling slightly as he fitted an old component into the test panel. The casing was scratched, one corner taped over, but the circuits lit up as soon as he connected it. Charles watched from a few feet behind, arms crossed, saying nothing. Next to him, James Parmenter, the lab supervisor, shifted uncomfortably. He'd known Charles for 15 years and had never seen him let anyone unvetted near equipment like this, much less a teenager. "Run the last 30 seconds of Flight 247 again," Charles said quietly. Parmenter tapped a few keys. On the central screen, digital altitude markers, velocity readouts, and trajectory lines began to pulse in sequence. Ethan stared at them, tracking each shift, each hesitation in the descent pattern. Then he pointed to a moment in the data stream. There, he said. See that dip in the lateral guidance? Parmenter squinted. Could be a wind vector anomaly. Ethan shook his head. It's not. The algorithm shifted control at 700 feet, right after a secondary signal override. My dad wrote a failsafe to block that handoff. Someone took it out. Charles felt his mouth go dry. He mentioned this in any report. Ethan turned to him. He tried. I found the notes in his backup drive. He logged everything, even the arguments. You didn't read them, did you? Charles didn't respond. The boy continued. You cut him from the project 2 months before the crash. Said he was slowing progress. Said he didn't understand deadlines. A silence spread between them, thick and unmoving. Charles hadn't expected to hear those words again, his own, thrown back at him in the voice of someone too young to have lived through the consequences. I didn't write the final clearance, Charles said, more to himself than to Ethan. The systems team. You signed the release, Ethan said. The air in the room changed. Parmenter lowered his head and stepped back. This wasn't a technical inquiry anymore. Charles stared at the stream. The dip repeated again, blinking like a pulse. He remembered the meeting, an ordinary Thursday. Whiteboard covered in acronyms, a dozen voices agreeing that Carter was difficult, not collaborative. He'd gone with the majority, rubber-stamped the transfer, cleared the way for the update. He said something that day. Charles murmured. Before he walked out, Ethan waited, jaw tight. He said, if you don't want to hear it now, you'll hear it in the wreckage. Charles looked at the screen. I thought he was being dramatic. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Charles walked over to a tall cabinet at the back of the lab. He opened it, rummaged through a few folders, then pulled out an old framed photograph team photo, year printed along the bottom, 2017. 20 people in jumpsuits, all smiling in front of the early prototype. Thomas Carter stood at the far right, half turned toward the camera, mouth unsmiling, hand on the shoulder of a younger technician. Charles stood at the center, arms folded. He took the photo from its frame, folded it carefully, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he turned to Parmenter. Get me a full pull on every software build from February of that year. I want the logs, the version trees, and any suppressed error reports. You're reopening it, Parmenter asked. I'm correcting it, Charles said. Then he looked at Ethan. And you're staying involved. I'm not going away, Ethan replied. Charles didn't smile, but there was the faintest nod of acknowledgement, like someone who had heard a language they hadn't let themselves understand for years. Outside the lab, the afternoon light had changed, slanting deeper into the corners. Ethan followed Charles out without a word, his footsteps light but sure. The house smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper. Karen hadn't been home when Ethan arrived. A neighbor had brought him in, said a few words to fill the quiet, then left without waiting for thanks. Ethan dropped his backpack by the door and walked to the narrow hallway off the kitchen, where the garage had been converted into his father's old workshop. Nothing had changed in 4 years. No one had dared to touch it. Dust layered every surface. A half-dismantled radio lay beside a cracked mug that still read, World's Okayest Engineer. Shelves sagged under the weight of binders, boxes, and tools organized with a logic only Thomas Carter would have understood. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment before walking in. He knew what he was looking for. The box was where it had always been under the workbench, marked only with a strip of blue tape and the number 47. He dragged it out, his knees hitting concrete. Inside were folders labeled with dates, scattered notes in his father's quick, slanted handwriting, and one worn, fire-scorched notebook wrapped in plastic. He opened it slowly. Diagrams, frequencies, margin scribbles about signal noise and secondary overrides, and symbols almost cryptic repeated across pages, always followed by a timestamp. On one page, his father had written, "Do not deploy unless redundancy is restored." Current chain is vulnerable to injection. Ethan traced the ink with his thumb. It was the same type of interference he'd seen on Charles's flight system just 2 days before. From behind, the floor creaked. Karen stood in the doorway, arms folded, hair pulled back into a loose bun. She looked tired, not from the day, but from years that had folded themselves into her body without asking. "You went back into the system, didn't you?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't answer. He just held up the notebook. Karen stepped closer, knelt beside him. Her fingers hovered over the page, then closed the cover gently. "Your father was afraid," she said. "Not of the technology, of what it would cost him to tell the truth." Ethan's voice was a whisper. "He told you some of it, not everything, but enough to know they didn't want him to finish the report. Someone from the company came to the house once. They argued in the garage. I only caught part of it." Ethan looked up. "Do you remember who?" Karen hesitated. "He had a folder with a gold seal. Said Thomas was endangering the timeline. I never saw him again. Ellison." "No, but he worked for them, or with them. He was younger, clean suit, the kind of man who apologizes without blinking." Ethan opened a smaller pouch inside the box. Inside was an old key and a sticky note that had yellowed at the edges. On it, in his father's handwriting, "When ready, 18/08/32. Karen leaned closer. "That's not a date." Ethan stared at it for a moment. His mind worked through combinations, dates, blueprints. Then it hit him. "It's a code," he said, "to the safe." The wall safe had been there as long as he could remember, hidden behind a drawer panel in the master bedroom closet. It hadn't been opened since his father's death. He stood up quickly. Karen followed. Upstairs, the air was still. Ethan pulled the panel loose, revealing the dial. His fingers moved carefully, muscle memory guiding him through the numbers. 18. Back to 8. Forward to 32. The safe clicked. The metal door creaked open slowly. Inside were 3 things: a flash drive, a sealed envelope, and a folder marked Series D, internal only. Ethan pulled them out, heart pounding. Karen didn't speak. Downstairs, a car drove by. The house returned to quiet. At the same hour, Charles Ellison stood alone in a conference room, lights dimmed, looking at the framed photo he'd pulled from the lab. It showed the 2017 project team, smiles stiff, suits too crisp. His own face stared back, untroubled. But now, it was Thomas Carter's expression that he couldn't stop seeing, focused, uncertain, already on the edge of being dismissed. Charles didn't sit. He called for his executive assistant. "I need access to the internal project archives," he said, "the ones that were closed after the 247 incident." "Sir, that was sealed by—" "I'm unsealing it." He stared at the photo again, his finger resting on one name, back in the hallway. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor. He held the flash drive between his fingers, trying to decide what he was ready to see. And then, without a word, he plugged it in. The safe had never held money. That much Ethan had always known. But he hadn't imagined it held the last unspoken pieces of a man who'd vanished without the world asking why. The folder marked Series D, internal only, lay on his lap like something fragile. Next to it sat the sealed envelope, untouched, and the flash drive, its plastic case slightly cracked. He took a breath, pulled his old laptop across the bed, and slid the drive into the side port. The screen flickered. Folder after folder opened dated documents, redlined schematics, encrypted logs. Most of it was dense references to firmware batches, interoffice memos, and fragments of test flights he only partly understood. But one file caught his eye, a video, labeled simply, "For Ethan, when ready." He clicked it. The screen showed a grainy image. His father sat at the desk in this very house, shoulders hunched, hair grayer than Ethan remembered. The lighting was dim. Behind him, the garage door was cracked open, letting in a sliver of light. His voice came slowly. "If you're watching this, Ethan, I guess I didn't make it home." The words hit harder than he expected. He didn't blink. I wanted to shield you from this, from the anger, the bureaucracy, the silence. But you're my son, and I think you'll understand what I couldn't get anyone else to see. Thomas lifted a diagram, circled in red. Ethan recognized it instantly. It matched the one from the lab. His father pointed to the lower margin. That right there, he said, that's the ghost command. Someone installed an override that allows the system to reroute based on external signals. It's not an accident. It's not even a flaw. It's an opening intended or ignored. It doesn't matter, because someone chose not to close it. He looked into the camera, then, voice quiet. They told me to stop asking questions, to stay in my lane, but a good engineer doesn't ignore what doesn't make sense. I raised the flag, and they buried it. I'm not asking you to take revenge. I'm asking you to remember the machine didn't fail. People did. Ethan froze. The room didn't move. The walls didn't shift. But something inside him did. A knock sounded at the door. It was almost 8. Karen had already gone to bed. Ethan wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie, paused the video, and opened the door. Charles Ellison stood on the porch, wearing a dark overcoat, no driver in sight. His tie was loose. His eyes, for the first time, looked human. I came alone, he said. Ethan didn't reply. I figured you'd open the safe. Ethan stepped aside. They sat in the living room. The screen still glowed faintly in the background. Charles didn't speak at first. He just watched the image of a man he'd once dismissed reappear through the screen, his voice carrying more weight than the boardroom ever allowed. Ethan pressed play. They sat in silence through the rest of the video. When it ended, the screen went dark. Neither of them moved. I signed off on the integration without reading his full report. Charles said, it wasn't deliberate, but it was convenient. And that's worse. Ethan stared at him. He died thinking no one believed him. Charles's face didn't shift. I didn't. Not then. A pause. You do now, I believe you, Charles said, and I believe he tried to stop something bigger than he realized. Ethan leaned back. He didn't ask for an apology. He wasn't sure he wanted one. After a while, Charles pointed to the envelope still sitting on the table. You haven't opened that. Ethan shook his head. I wasn't sure if it was for now. Charles looked down. May I tell you the rest? The parts he didn't know. Ethan didn't nod. He didn't speak, but he didn't close the laptop either. The living room lights were dimmed. The corners of the house held in a hush that didn't belong to any ordinary evening. Ethan sat forward on the couch, arms resting on his knees. Across from him, Charles sat not as a CEO, but as a man who had run out of excuses. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was offering something closer to confession. It started with funding, Charles said, voice low, DARPA contracts, congressional pressure. There was a clock on everything we did. Ethan said nothing. His eyes stayed on the man, but they didn't soften. We were building the fastest navigation interface ever deployed in civilian aerospace. Your father kept raising flags, tiny details at first, inconsistencies no one wanted to see, and I let the others call it obstruction. He looked down, hands laced together. I didn't want to believe that ignoring him would lead here. I didn't think. Karen stood quietly by the kitchen doorway, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea she hadn't touched. Her eyes never left Charles. If there had been warmth between them once, it had frozen into something harder. Her silence spoke louder than either of them. You knew, she said, and you let them push him out. Charles looked at her, and for a moment he didn't look like a titan of industry. He looked like a man aged by a single decision that kept echoing. I didn't kill him, he said softly, but I let him die in silence. And that silence, I carry it. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to yell, to throw the files back in Charles's face, to say none of it mattered now. But part of him knew the truth. He wasn't looking at a liar anymore. He was looking at someone who had once been too cowardly to choose right over safe. He didn't want to be right, Ethan said. He wanted someone to listen. The room went still. Only the fridge hummed in the background, the house too quiet for comfort. Then a knock at the front door. Karen flinched. Ethan rose, crossing the living room quickly. He opened the door to find a man in a dark suit, pilot wings pinned to his lapel, the kind of man who moved like he expected doors to open for him. His name came with the badge, Martin Blake, Chief Operating Officer, Ellison Aerotech. "Apologies," Martin said with a polite smile. "This is a private matter, but I think we need to end this conversation." Charles stood behind Ethan now, back stiffened. "Martin, this isn't your call. I'm afraid it is." Martin replied, "This boy trespassed on federal property. You've involved him far enough." Martin stepped inside without waiting for permission. The smile stayed on his face, but something cold flickered beneath it, like a man who'd smiled through far worse. Karen moved closer to Ethan instinctively. "I'm sorry," Martin continued, addressing Ethan now. "I understand this must feel important, but some truths don't belong in public hands. They belong in review committees, compliance teams, not in the hands of a child." Charles's eyes narrowed. He's not a child. He's the only one in the room asking the right questions. Martin tilted his head, as if amused, then let the right people answer them. As he reached for his coat, something slipped from his inner pocket, a small, ridged cylinder. Ethan's eyes caught the shape before Martin could tuck it back in. It was identical to the device Ethan had drawn from memory, the same frequency module he'd found beneath the jet. Small, innocuous to anyone who hadn't seen one disassembled on a garage workbench. Martin noticed the glance. He pocketed it quickly, but it was too late. Ethan looked at Charles. The look said everything. They both saw it. They both understood. Charles stepped forward. "Where did you get that?" Martin smiled again, wider this time. "You're tired." "Charles, maybe let someone else handle things now." But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He was already building the next move in his head. The hangar was colder than Ethan expected. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from outside. It was the stillness of metal and concrete, locked up and waiting, holding secrets no one wanted to touch. Floodlights hung high above, but Charles had ordered them dimmed. Only the perimeter lights remained, casting long shadows on the polished floor. Charles moved quietly beside Ethan, his steps measured. The boy carried the printed schematics, rolled tight under one arm, while Charles held a secure tablet connected to the test server. "Stay close," he whispered. "What we're doing tonight doesn't go in any report. Not yet." The space looked like any other research facility, rows of simulation pods, a few maintenance carts, diagnostic rigs, but at the far end of the building stood a single aircraft nose cone, suspended on a hydraulic rig. Ethan's breath caught when he saw it. He knew that model. It was the exact system his father had worked on, the one that never made it past prototype stage. They climbed into the rigged cockpit. The panel was live, connected to a local terminal. Charles tapped a few commands, and the display lit up with diagnostic feedback. "This is our test harness," he said. "It mimics flight conditions down to the signal latency." Ethan nodded, his eyes already scanning the status feed. He pointed to a line of code streaming down the screen. "That's not right. That's a foreign handshake." Charles frowned. "Meaning, it's like a fake key. The system thinks it's talking to the satellite, but it's not. Someone spoofed it." He reached for the spare module in the case beside him. It matched the one they had pulled earlier, down to the serial number. Ethan clicked it into place. The screen blinked. Flight logic rerouted instantly, showing a silent override. Charles's mouth tightened. This was signed off by Martin last quarter. He approved the supplier. "It's not a software bug," Ethan said. "It's hardware substitution. These modules aren't just defective. They're meant to redirect." The room around them buzzed lightly, like it always did when the servers were active, but then something shifted. The monitor blinked, not with code, but black. Then it reset. Camera feed just cut. Charles muttered. They looked at each other. Footsteps echoed across the hangar, slow, purposeful, not rushed, not nervous, confident. Charles grabbed Ethan's arm, pulled him behind the simulator rig. They crouched low. From the shadows, they saw a man enter wearing a maintenance jacket logoed like the rest of the team, but unfamiliar. Ethan had memorized the whole staff list from the visitor badge he was issued. This man wasn't on it. The intruder moved with precision, heading directly for the central diagnostics machine. He pulled something from his pocket, a small device, smooth and dark, and pressed it against the side of the console. Lights blinked once, then held steady. "What's he doing?" Ethan whispered. Charles didn't answer. He was already pulling his phone from his coat. The man worked quickly. After 20 seconds, he removed the device, tucked it into his pocket, and walked out without a backward glance. His footsteps faded into the far end of the hangar, until the large door hissed closed behind him. Silence returned. Charles didn't wait. He stood, unlocked his phone, and began typing. "We send this now," he said, voice low, before someone else erases it. He uploaded the module data, Ethan's screenshots, the diagnostic outputs. All of it went to a secure line linked to the FBI's cybercrimes division, a back-channel Charles had only used once before, years ago. Ethan stared at the doorway, still catching his breath. "Do you think he knew we were here?" "Doesn't matter anymore," Charles said. He hit send. The screen blinked transmission in progress. "More than 40 aircraft," Ethan said softly. "That's what Dad wrote in his notes." Charles didn't look at him. He was watching the signal bar climb toward 100%, and for the first time that night, his hands trembled. The air inside the San Francisco FBI field office was sterile and tense. Glass walls, secure doors, and the steady hum of servers formed the backdrop as Eliza Morell sat across from Charles and Ethan. She was in her late 30s, sharp-featured with hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, eyes that rarely blinked when she focused. She tapped a pen slowly on her notepad while Ethan recounted everything again. Charles sat beside him, silent. This was Ethan's moment. The boy spoke calmly, precisely, with none of the stuttering or nervousness people expected from someone his age. He pulled up the USB, he showed the video, then the charts, then the emails, then the line item purchase orders, cross-referenced with off-books suppliers, every file organized, highlighted, time-stamped. Eliza finally leaned back. "And you're telling me this module she lifted a printout is currently installed in active aircraft?" "Yes," Ethan said. "We traced shipments to at least 42 installations, including 7 on government contracts. And who signed these?" Charles opened his tablet. "Martin Blake. He's the current COO. He has authority to override supplier restrictions." Ethan found Connection's silent investments in the subcontractors. Eliza looked between them, her expression unreadable. Then she stood. "Excuse me." She left the room without another word. The door hissed shut. Charles glanced at Ethan. "You did well." Ethan was still staring at the door. "Do you think she believed me? She believes the data. That's all that matters right now. Outside." Eliza entered another room, locked the door behind her, and placed a call. Her voice was low and tight. "We have something bigger than expected. This isn't negligence. It's infrastructure-level fraud tied to aviation security, and a civilian miner uncovered it." There was a pause. "No," she said. "We don't need to go wide yet, but we need eyes on Blake, miles away, in a corner suite of a boutique hotel in Los Altos." Martin Blake stood with his back to the window. The sun dipped below the hills, bathing the room in a soft amber hue, but the light didn't reach his face. 3 men sat across the table, silent, as Martin unrolled a small schematic. "This is the current phase," he said. "I've pulled the next shipment. There's too much chatter in the valley. They're not just poking around anymore. That boy knows something." One of the men, older, leaned forward. "What do you suggest?" "We stall," Martin said, "and we remove the exposure." Permanently, Martin didn't answer right away. He simply looked out the window, then said, "They cannot reach Washington with that data. If they do, it's over for all of us." Back in the FBI building, Eliza returned. She looked at Ethan with a different weight in her voice. "We're escalating this," she said. "But you're not safe. Both of you need protection. Until we issue a freeze, they still have access to personnel tracking." Ethan's stomach turned. "My mom's at home." Charles was already on his phone. No signal. The building had suppression bands. He turned to Eliza. "We need to move. Now." Within minutes. They were in the car, Charles driving, Ethan in the passenger seat, Eliza behind them coordinating via encrypted radio. The road blurred as they raced down 101 toward Redwood City. The sky was dark when they pulled into Ethan's neighborhood. Everything looked still. Too still. Ethan jumped from the car before Charles could stop him. The front door to the house was ajar. Wind rustled the edges of the open screen. He burst through the threshold, heart pounding. Mom. Silence. He turned the corner into the living room. The lamp was on. Her teacup sat on the table, still warm. And on the floor, her phone. Face cracked. A single call was still ringing through from an unknown number. Charles walked in slowly behind him, scanning the space. No sign of a struggle. No note. Just absence. Eliza's voice came through the door. "We have no alerts from perimeter security. No neighbors noticed movement. Whoever it was knew how to stay invisible." Ethan picked up the phone, hand trembling. "She wouldn't leave without telling me. Not now. Not after everything." Charles knelt beside him. "We'll find her." But Ethan didn't answer. He was looking past him toward the hallway closet. Its door was slightly ajar. They moved Ethan just before sunrise. No sirens, no formal handoff. Just a quiet drive through the back streets of Palo Alto into the hills, where a rented home sat behind 2 security gates and a row of eucalyptus trees. The FBI called it a safe zone. To Ethan, it felt like a cage lined with polite silence and too many locks. Charles arrived 2 hours later without a tie for the first time in memory. His sleeves were rolled, eyes red, jaw tight. He stepped into the living room, where Ethan was sitting on the carpet with a laptop open and a map of Washington, D.C. spread beside him. "You didn't sleep?" Charles asked. Ethan shook his head. "She wouldn't sleep either. Not where they're keeping her." Charles said nothing. He sat down across from the boy, staring at the wall for a long moment before finally speaking. "We're moving forward. With the hearing." He nodded. "We're going to make it public. Loud. Let them hear us coming." Ethan glanced at him, skeptical. "And Martin?" "That's the point." Charles looked him square in the eye. "We give him a window to act. We let him think he still holds the strings. The bait was simple, but risky. News would leak strategically of a pending testimony before the Federal Aviation Commission. Ethan Carter, a teen whistleblower, would speak under oath. His father's death, the corrupted modules, the procurement trail, everything would go on the record. Within hours, press interest ignited, not from CNN or The Times, but smaller stations hungry for a fresh scandal. Ethan agreed to one interview with a local channel in San Mateo. The setup was modest: 1 camera, 1 desk, and a reporter named Alicia, who smiled gently as she adjusted her microphone. "You sure you want to do this?" Charles had asked him outside the studio. Ethan just said, "If he sees me talking, he knows we're not backing down." Under the lights, Ethan's voice was calm. "I didn't come here to blame anyone. I just want to make sure what happened to my dad doesn't happen to other families. I'm not a hero. I just did what my dad would have done." The clip went viral within hours. People across the country saw a kid in a plain blue shirt, eyes too tired for his age, speaking with the clarity of someone who had already lost more than most. Back in the shadows of a rented townhouse, Martin Blake watched in silence. He didn't slam the desk or curse the screen. He simply turned to a man standing behind him and said, "We have a deadline now." Charles, meanwhile, was digging through a different battlefield. He had a team of ex-analysts working through the paper trail left by Martin's shell companies, searching not just for corruption, but for location, shipment logs, missing manifests, GPS blackouts. Somewhere in that mess was the route that had taken Karen Carter out of their reach. Eliza Morell kept the pressure up from the bureau. She coordinated escorts, swept Ethan's safe house twice a day, and ran counter-intel to see if Martin had moved anything major. but nothing was certain. They were playing chess with a man who didn't flinch. That night, after the sun dropped behind the hills and the lights in the safe house dimmed, Charles stepped onto the porch with his phone. The breeze was cold, but not enough to chase him inside. He watched the empty road and breathed like someone trying to push a weight off his chest. His phone buzzed. A message. No sender ID. Just a single link. He tapped it. The screen loaded slowly. A dimly lit room appeared. Karen Carter was in the frame, hands tied, blindfold on, unmoving. The camera panned just enough to show the steel table beside her. Then a voice spoke. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You will cancel the testimony, Martin said, or this becomes her last recorded hour. Charles stared at the screen for a long time, the weight of it all pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, the light inside flickered as Ethan stepped toward the door, unaware that everything had just shifted again. The warehouse was quiet, but not still. A draft passed through the thin metal walls, making the sheet of blueprints on the table flutter like restless hands. Charles stood at one end, jaw clenched, eyes flicking between the security feed and the clock. They had 6 minutes left, maybe less. Across the room, Ethan sat with a recorder in his hand. A worn, silver device that still bore his father's initials scratched faintly near the battery latch. He played the tape again, slowly. If you do this, I won't stay quiet. His father's voice was tired but steady. Then came the response. You're ending your own career. Thomas. Charles's voice, cold, controlled, familiar. Ethan didn't move. His fingers dug slightly into the recorder's sides, but he said nothing. The tape stopped. Silence filled the space between them like a third person in the room. Charles didn't look away. I remember that call. Ethan finally met his eyes. You hung up on him. Charles nodded. I did. There was no defense, no excuse, just the dull weight of a man who'd run out of ways to outrun himself. He called again an hour later. Charles continued. I didn't answer. I told myself it was over, that it would die down. He inhaled slowly. It did. But so did he. Ethan's hands curled into fists. The recorder lay on the table between them. Like a witness, neither of them could refute. Charles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card, slim, metallic, and marked with the Ellison Aerotech logo. He laid it in front of Ethan. My internal access pass. Level 7. The kind your father was supposed to receive. Ethan stared at it. He didn't touch it. Charles's voice dropped lower. It opens every archive. Procurement logs, test reports, staff memos, even ones the board doesn't know exist. Outside the warehouse, the FBI team was setting the trap. A mock transfer route had been leaked to draw Martin Blake into view. The hope was simple. He'd attempt an interception. In doing so, he'd expose himself. Inside, the past was unraveling. Ethan finally picked up the card. I thought you came to help me. Turns out, you're just cleaning up your own mess. Charles didn't deny it, but then he said, sometimes the only way to clean it up is by handing over everything you were afraid to face. Ethan turned to the console, inserted the access card, and watched the screen illuminate. A list of directories appeared, rows of codes, dates, locations. Some stamped confidential, others buried beneath levels of digital camouflage. He typed in a sequence from his father's notes. One folder opened, inside shipment logs, supplier lists, GPS data overlays. One map expanded across the screen, marking 5 warehouse points across the western states. One dot pulsed red, near a forgotten industrial zone on the outskirts of Bakersfield. The timestamp on the last logged activity was just 2 days ago. Karen Carter. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He pulled the coordinates and turned to Charles. I know where they're keeping her. The older man stepped forward, looking at the map, then back at Ethan. For a moment, no words passed between them. Just a weight too large for either of them to carry alone. Charles finally whispered, Then we go now. But Ethan didn't respond. His eyes hadn't left the screen. Something else had lit up in the corner of the interface, a flag tied to a movement sensor, recently reactivated. And whatever it meant, it wasn't done moving. The warehouse stood in a desolate corner of Stockton, surrounded by chain-link fencing and broken asphalt. Weeds grew through cracks like silent reminders that things abandoned weren't always forgotten. The FBI had the perimeter locked. Tactical agents swept through the first two hangars with precision, no resistance, no signs of life until they reached the third. Inside, under weak fluorescent lights, the air held a chemical sting. Boxes were stacked in uniform rows, each labeled with cryptic serials and foreign acronyms. Toward the back, a steel door rattled under the push of a crowbar. It opened to a dim storage room lined with metal shelves. In the center, slouched and gagged, was Karen Carter. She blinked slowly when the door swung open. Her wrists, bruised and bound, flexed instinctively as light poured in. For a second, she didn't recognize the small figure slipping in behind the agents until he knelt before her. "Mom." Ethan's voice cracked. His hands worked fast, fingers trembling as he fumbled with the duct tape. Karen's eyes welled, but her voice hoarse broke through. "You shouldn't be here." He didn't answer, just held her tighter than he ever had. Footsteps clattered from the corridor. The agent shouted, "We're not clear." Step back, but it was too late. Martin Blake appeared like a shadow pressed into flesh. One arm yanked Ethan back, the other jammed a small pistol against the boy's temple. His face was calm, lips twisted in a casual smile. "Well," he said, "I guess Thomas Carter really did raise someone who couldn't stay out of trouble." Ethan didn't flinch, but his chest heaved once. Karen let out a sound part scream, part warning, but froze when Martin's grip tightened. "I knew this place would be your undoing," Martin whispered near Ethan's ear. "Your father made the same mistake, thinking the truth alone was enough." Suddenly, a voice cut in from the corridor behind. "No. The mistake was thinking no one would stand in your way." Charles stepped into view. He wasn't armed, no tactical gear, no vest. Just his gray wool coat, damp at the hem, and a face stripped of pretense. He walked steadily forward, both hands open at his sides. Martin shifted slightly, the barrel of his pistol twitching toward Charles. "Don't," he warned. "You don't get to play hero, Charles." Charles's voice stayed level. "I'm not here to play anything, but if you want this to end, you'll have to go through me first." The room held still. Karen, barely breathing, reached out without realizing it. Ethan, locked in Martin's hold, didn't blink. His fingers slowly moved along his wrist, toward the small GPS tracker hidden under his sleeve. Then came the sound, faint at first, then unmistakable. The soft static of a radio, a buzz in Martin's earpiece, and then the command, "Go." The door burst open. Tactical boots hit concrete. Red beams from rifles danced across the walls. Martin flinched, but not fast enough. Two agents tackled him from behind. The gun clattered away. Ethan dropped to the ground, coughing, arms shielding his head. Karen screamed his name and tried to rise, but the agents were already there pulling her free, surrounding them both. Martin Blake didn't resist. His smirk was gone. In its place, a stillness, like a man who'd finally been caught by something heavier than law. Outside, paramedics waited. Inside, agents logged the crates, each holding rows of the same counterfeit modules that had nearly killed hundreds. Charles stood near the doorway, watching the scene unfold. One agent approached, handing him a tablet. "All files are being uploaded. Full chain of evidence. It's solid." Charles nodded. His gaze drifted to Ethan, who sat with Karen beside an open crate. His mother's hand gripped his, steady now. Whole. Charles let out a slow breath. In all his years, he'd never felt what he felt now. Not pride, not relief, just lightness. Like something old had finally loosened. The lights inside the National Press Club gleamed too bright for that hour. Midnight. And yet, no one had left. Cameras blinked like restless eyes. Dozens of reporters filled the rows, murmurs swelling and fading in ripples. Outside, protesters lined the sidewalk under umbrellas. the streets wet with the last breath of spring rain. Inside. Charles Ellison adjusted the knot of his tie once, then stepped up to the podium. He didn't clear his throat, didn't blink at the flashes, just gripped the edge of the wooden lectern like a man holding on to something steadier than himself. "My name is Charles Ellison," he began, his voice flat but unshaken. "And until tomorrow morning, I am the CEO of Ellison Aerotech." A pause. The murmur in the room stilled. Behind him, a screen lit up. Folders of files, technical specs, internal emails, a list of subcontractors each tied to the faulty modules. None of it edited, none of it shielded. Charles inhaled through his nose. 4 years ago, a senior engineer named Thomas Carter filed a report about discrepancies in our navigation systems. He warned about a possible failure cascade, something that could be triggered by unauthorized parts entering our production cycle. His hand trembled slightly on the lectern. He looked down, then back at the audience. He was ignored, then isolated, then let go. Ethan, seated in the front row, stared quietly at the man speaking. He held his mother's hand, but his gaze never left the stage. Not once. Charles continued. "I signed the termination. I allowed internal channels to be redirected. I convinced myself it was for efficiency, for profitability, for the board. But the truth is simpler. I was afraid. And I let a man die with the weight of our silence on his shoulders." Gasps echoed. The room held its breath. Charles's voice softened, not as a CEO, but as someone remembering the shape of a guilt long carried. "Tonight, I'm here not just to acknowledge that mistake. I'm here to correct what I can, to name what we failed to name." He turned slightly, gesturing behind him. "All the data has been released to federal investigators. Our cooperation is full and irreversible, and effective immediately. I am resigning from all leadership roles within Ellison Aerotech." A flash storm of questions erupted, but Charles raised a hand. "I'm not leaving empty-handed," he said. "I'm establishing the Carter Fellowship Fund, a scholarship for the children of aerospace workers who challenge assumptions, who speak when they're told to stay silent." He looked at Ethan. "For those who remind us what courage actually looks like, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It held weight, agreement, and something closer to grief." From his seat, Ethan stood. No one called on him. He walked to the stage slowly, one step at a time, his shoes echoing on the polished floor. The crowd quieted. Even the cameras seemed to pause, their shutters stilled. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, old. The edges softened from time and handling. He unfolded it gently, the creases remembering fingers long gone. He faced the audience, voice steady. "My father wrote this during his final week at the company. I found it in a notebook buried under his drawings." He raised the paper, though he didn't need to. He had memorized the words. "The truth is only heavy when you carry it alone." No one moved. No one spoke. He lowered the paper, looked at Charles not with accusation, but with something more difficult. Something like release. Karen rose from her seat in the front row, her eyes rimmed red, her hands folded tightly. She didn't look at the cameras, only at her son. Behind them. The screen faded to black. Charles stepped aside. Ethan stood at the podium, and the lights, though blinding, didn't seem so harsh now. The quiet inside the house felt different now. Not heavy, not brittle like it had been in the weeks after the crash. It felt like a pause, like the silence between two pieces of music, not the end of one. Karen moved carefully around the kitchen, her motions deliberate. She poured tea for Ethan and herself, setting the cups down without clatter. The boy didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the laptop in front of him. The folder named Personal had been there for years, but they'd never dared open everything. Until now. He clicked the final video. It wasn't labeled, just a timestamp from years ago. The screen filled with a grainy image, his father, sitting on the worn green armchair in their old apartment in San Diego, back when Ethan's legs didn't touch the floor yet. Thomas was holding a toddler version of Ethan, who giggled, reaching for the camera. Then Thomas looked into the lens. His voice, soft and steady, filled the room like a returning wind. If you're seeing this, Ethan, then maybe I didn't get to tell you enough. Maybe I didn't get to finish what I started. But I need you to hear this. Karen sat beside her son, both motionless. Thomas looked down at the boy on his lap, then back up. Sometimes the truth makes you lose things. Friends, jobs, time. But it's not meant to destroy you. It's meant to test who you really are. And you, my son, you already carry more light than I ever had. He leaned forward slightly. Don't be afraid to stand alone. Because if you do it for the right reason, you'll never really be alone. One day, you'll understand. The screen faded to black. Ethan didn't say anything. He just closed the laptop slowly. His mother's hand found his. Then the doorbell rang. Karen moved first, wiping her eyes quickly. When she opened the door, Charles Ellison stood there, dressed in plain slacks and a coat too big for his frame. No bodyguard, no press, just him. He didn't ask to come in. He waited. I won't take much of your time, he said, voice quieter than usual. But there's something I want to return. He held out a small box. Inside was a bronze figure, simple, but unmistakably powerful. A man standing in profile, one hand at his side, the other lifted above his head holding a blueprint. His face was sculpted from old photographs, and even though it wasn't perfect, Ethan knew the features by heart. It's called The Witness, Charles said. We designed it last year for a new memorial in Arlington, but I had this one cast before I left the company. I couldn't put it on a boardroom wall. That would have made it look like atonement. It's not. Karen stepped closer. Her fingers hovered over the figure, then rested lightly on the base. I want people to remember Thomas Carter, Charles continued, not as someone who died trying, but someone who led, someone who stood still while the rest of us moved around him, too fast, too loud, too scared. He looked at Ethan. You didn't ask for this burden, but you've carried it with more grace than I ever did. No more was said. He set the box down on the table inside the door, nodded once, and walked away down the front steps. The late afternoon light came through the blinds, casting long stripes across the floor. Ethan picked up the statue with both hands and placed it on the windowsill. His mother watched, her expression unreadable but softer now, edges worn by something close to peace. He went back to his laptop. There was a new notification, an email flagged priority. It was from the National Youth Aerospace Council. The subject line read, Invitation to deliver closing speech, Annual Young Aerospace Futures Summit, Washington, D.C. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen, then leaned back in the chair. And somewhere in that stillness, something old settled, and something new began. The stage was smaller than Ethan had imagined. Just a wooden platform draped in navy fabric, beneath a simple spotlight. But to him, it felt like standing on a ridge, the world on one side, his past on the other. The conference hall in Seattle was nearly full scientists in clean-cut suits, students with notepads, rows of silent listeners who had come not to debate technology, but to hear a story. Ethan adjusted the microphone. He had no slideshow, no charts, just a note folded in his back pocket and something older in his chest. When I was 7, he began, my father used to let me sit on his workbench while he soldered wires for the next prototype. He never explained what each part did. He just said, everything here has a purpose, even if it's small, especially if it's small. The audience didn't move. My dad was a systems engineer at Ellison Aerotech. His name was Thomas Carter. Some of you know that name now. Some didn't until recently. But to me, he was just a man who looked at every broken thing like it could still be fixed. Ethan took a breath. His hand brushed the edge of his jacket, just over his forearm. A small patch, frayed from time, clung to the sleeve, a stitched emblem of a gear cradled by wings. his father's engineering badge carefully sewn by his mother onto his blazer the night before. They fired him because he wouldn't ignore a problem, Ethan said, and he died before anyone would listen. His voice didn't rise. It stayed steady, like a current pushing gently but firmly forward. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because he was right. And because my mother, who sat through courtrooms and empty bank accounts and sleepless nights, refused to let the truth die with him. In the front row, Karen sat perfectly still. Her hands were clasped in her lap. Only her eyes moved, shining, locked on her son. Ethan reached down to the side of the podium and lifted a framed certificate. Not printed by a school, not signed by a board, but by the Carter Foundation, just ink, paper, and meaning. This, he said, holding it with both hands, is a recognition of integrity, of loyalty, of sacrifice. It doesn't come with a salary, but I think it's the highest honor I've ever seen. He stepped off the stage and walked to the edge of the aisle. Charles, seated a few rows back, straightened. His eyes were glassy, but proud. Ethan approached his mother. She looked at the frame, then at him. She didn't speak. He placed it gently in her hands. Then, almost like a whisper, he said, "For keeping the light on." The hall, for a long second, remained silent. Then someone stood, then another, and another. There were no cheers, no loud ovations, just applause measured, honest, and rising like slow thunder. It wasn't for heroism. It wasn't for revenge. It was for something that had survived. Ethan returned to the stage, but only for a moment. The next speaker was already approaching, program in hand. As Ethan passed him, the man said softly, "Your dad would have been proud." "I know," Ethan replied, "but I wanted him to hear it, too." Outside the hall, the air was sharp with early spring. Karen wrapped her coat tighter around herself, while Charles waited near the curb, his hands in his pockets. Ethan stood a moment before joining them. His sleeve caught a gust of wind, and the patch lifted slightly. It fluttered like a flag, not to declare victory, but to remind the world that something had endured. He didn't look back, but he knew. Something had shifted forward. It had rained that morning. The flagstones in the Stanford courtyard were still damp, darkened to a deeper shade of gray. Students passed by in light jackets, notebooks under arm, their chatter fading as they neared the corner exhibit, tucked between the old physics building and the campus library. A modest sign read, "The Silent Pioneers." Inside the open-air display, under a clear canopy, stood a glass case. Within it, the original guidance system prototype etched metal, marked by the work of steady hands that had believed in every piece. Next to it, a small bronze sculpture, 2 hands, one large, one small, palms cupped upward, cradling a folded piece of carved copper, a blueprint caught in time. Ethan had sculpted it with his own hands. It had taken him 6 months, not because he didn't know how, but because he wanted to get the weight right. Karen stood just beyond the railing, her coat buttoned tight. She didn't approach the case. She only looked, every few minutes. She would glance down at her gloves, as if checking for dust that wasn't there. Charles was already inside, wiping the fingerprint smudges from the corner of the glass. He didn't wear a badge anymore. He wasn't listed on any board, but he came every week. No one asked him to. There were no news crews, no speeches. Just a few curious students, a couple of engineers, a professor who paused on his way to class. And somewhere in that small silence, something settled. Ethan stepped out of the building behind them. He didn't go straight to the display. Instead, he walked the perimeter. The air smelled of eucalyptus and wet stone. In his coat pocket was a folded note, an invitation to speak at next year's Federal Design Forum. But for now, he didn't think about it. He just breathed. A tug on his jacket startled him. A boy, no older than 8, with dark hair and a crooked smile, looked up at him. "Are you the guy who talked at the conference last year?" The boy asked. Ethan crouched to his level. "Yeah," he said softly. "That was me. My teacher showed us the video. My dad said you made people tell the truth. Ethan smiled, but didn't answer right away. The boy looked at the sculpture. Those are your hands. One of them, Ethan replied. The other belonged to someone I still follow. The boy nodded, then ran back to a group by the fountain. Ethan stood, watching him go. In his chest, something shifted, not in grief, not even in pride, just movement, like a gear finding its place again. He turned back toward the building. Karen was sitting now, on a bench near the walkway. Charles had his hands in his pockets, watching a leaf swirl down beside the curb. No words were needed. That evening, at home, a package sat on their doorstep. No return address, just an old leather-bound box and a note. This was his. It should be yours now. Inside a journal. Its spine was cracked, pages stiff from age and careful use. At the top of the first entry, a line written in Thomas Carter's narrow, angled script. Systems are only complex until you learn to listen. People are the same. Karen stood behind Ethan, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't ask who had sent it. He just opened the first page, eyes steady, posture quiet. Like someone not revisiting the past, but walking it forward. On the edge of the campus lawn, a boy in a borrowed jacket watched the wind stir a paper tucked in his palm. It wasn't new. It had folds and creases. Ink faded from time, but the lines still held. Maybe that's how truth works. It doesn't shine. It stays, quiet, steady, waiting for someone to pick it up again. And sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to carry it a little farther.